you noticed we have leaflets in bag for our speaker next month. Michael Schwartz, a professor at Stony Brook. He'll be talking about the Iraqi war and the surge and the effects of the surge. But one thing to maybe get you more interested in, he is an expert on statistics. And he has concluded from the studies of the British Medical Society, certain American medical groups, that the statistical probability is that 1,200,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed because of the lies of our president and the administration. 1,200,000. It's like a Holocaust. And it just keeps going on. I'd like to have Jim Brown, a member of our board, to introduce our speaker. Jim made all the arrangements to have our speaker, and he'll introduce her, and I'll sit down.
Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, since 9/11, Muslims around the world in this country have been under increasing attack in the United States. And many of them have been vilified, many of them rounded up and deported. And our speaker tonight will be dealing with this problem, also the problem of the fact that the left has been more or less silent on this matter as this situation has gotten pretty bad over the years. Deepa Kumar, I first heard her speak on this topic at the Left Forum, and it was very good that at that venue that she spoke on this topic, and she's going to be with us tonight to do a similar kind of talk. She's the assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, and she's written many articles on this subject, including some on the cartoon controversy, and those articles have been read around the world. She also has a new book, Outside the Box, which is about the UPS strike in 1997 by the Teamsters, which was an interesting strike. Being a former Teamster myself and supporter of Ron Carey at that time, it was really interesting for me to read that book, and she interviews Ron Carey there. And it's a good analysis of how sometimes the labor unions and the left can actually get out their point of view to the media. It's a good theoretical and practical book. But tonight's going to be speaking primarily about Islamophobia, the problem that Muslims have faced since 9/11. So if you give a warm welcome to Deepa Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for having me, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday evening. I appreciate it. Glad the weather was working with us. Did it rain here yesterday? Was it miserable?
Yes.
Put the mic down.
I will. Well, I have prepared a nice PowerPoint presentation for you, but unfortunately that's not going to work out, so I have a backup, and I just have 10 of these, so if people can share, that would be delightful. Number of cartoons and images, and I'll point you to it as I come to them. Right, so thanks again for coming out, and thank you, Jim. And this is actually the topic of my second book, and what brought me to this question is, being a part of the anti-war movement, it was somewhat frustrating to find that even though the anti-war movement took up a number of issues exposing the lies of Bush administration and so on, it has done very little actually to talk about the means by which an entire group of people, Muslims, have been demonized to advance the agenda of empire. And so I've been talking about it, been going around the country talking about it, and it's my great pleasure to be here tonight to share my thoughts with you. So I want to start with a few examples of how this process of vilification has been taking place since 9/11. Now, immediately after 9/11, the sales of the Quran, the religious book of Islam, actually increased quite dramatically in the West. And people were turning to this holy book of Islam to somehow try to find an explanation for why the events of 9/11 took place, as if to say that Islam itself was to blame for the events of 9/11. And I think this logic is actually quite specious, and I'll give you a concrete example to show why that is so. Timothy McVeigh, we know he was a Christian fundamentalist. When he carried out the bombings in Oklahoma City, there wasn't a similar search within the Bible to try to find why this man had committed these atrocities. So if you compare these two cases, I think it's quite revealing. Whereas on the one hand, Islam itself is blamed for the actions of a few extremists, on the other hand, Christianity does not come under the same kind of scrutiny for the actions of extremists. So I just wanted to start there with that example. And then over the years, over the last 7 years, I think the attack on Muslims and so on has been quite relentless. A few more examples. In 2005, a series of cartoons were published in the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten that actually caricatured Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. And when Muslims protested this, they were denounced for not appreciating free speech. And again, no distinction was made here between free speech and hate speech, right? Any civilized society, any society that considers itself tolerant would not accept, for instance, anti-Semitic images or racist images against African Americans or any other minority group. But when it comes to making fun of Muslims, apparently there is no bottom, there is no limit to it. Another more recent example is when the United Arab Emirates company was supposed to take over the running of 6 US ports in early 2006. You may remember this. It was a massive xenophobic backlash, both Democrats and Republicans sort of wailing about how we can't trust foreigners to run our ports. Never mind, of course, that it was a British company that was running these very same ports prior to this. So I want to start with the first cartoons that I have there. If people can turn to the very first, you'll see some of the cartoons that came out around that context. What you see in the background is these very stereotypical, supposedly Arab characters. They look quite stupid, they look quite scary at the same time, and then you have this head guy in the middle, and you can read it. It says, "Hello, American friends, meet the new management team. Now, excuse me, I've got to run." So it's got all of those, lazy, stupid Arabs and so on. So that's the first part of it. And then the second cartoon, please be assured that under United Arab Emirates control, your American ports will be secure as we work tirelessly to intercept blasphemous drawings of Muhammad and spawn of Satan Danish cartoons and so on. Now, what this refers to is another very often used theme, and that is the idea that Arabs cannot be trusted, they're full of guile, and so on. And this applies even to Persians. The next cartoon, you'll see, it is this man sitting on what seems to be a flying carpet, right? This is the typical bag of tricks that Hollywood has used at least since the 1920s. How do you present Arab land? You have flying carpets, you have an oasis, you have some dancing girls, you have a few harems, and that's it. We will get no more complicated than that really simplistic picture. So here we have it. We have a mullah sitting on top of nuclear weapons saying, "What nuclear weapons, sir?" And then the last one I want to draw your attention to is, that's Ahmadinejad in the and can you see how his face is drawn? Look at the nose. Now, if you look back and you see some of the anti-Semitic stereotypes, that's exactly how Jews were also portrayed, is with these big noses, these hooked noses, and so on. And that so ironically gets transposed onto Arabs and Persians today. And of course, here again we have an example of guile. Our nuclear program is peaceful, and so on and so on. All right. Now, more recently, in October of this year, you may have heard about David Horowitz and his Islamofascism Awareness Week. Well, allegedly that week was supposed to raise awareness in the United States of the threat that Islamist organizations pose. And this threat, apparently, is that they're going to create this vast Muslim empire that spreads from Europe to North Africa, all the way to East Asia. And so I want to show you one of the supposedly educational tools that they have on their website.
Could you read to us what it said before? It said the goal of jihad?
Yes.
Couldn't read it well? It was hard to see.
Let's finish it and I'll come back and show it to you.
Interesting music. Interesting music.
Yeah.
Background music to the movie Omen.
The lights, you know.
Chavez is a jihad.
Do you want to go back to the beginning? It's the same thing.
The orange print said something jihad.
Let's see what it says.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, that's it.
His world's on.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
All right.
No, he could have said something.
You know, enjoy the rest of these on your own. It's terrorismawareness.org. But I bring that up really because it's a perfect example of the kind of argument that is being made. And the kind of argument that's being made is that there is this large, menacing, organized terrorist force out there against which an endless war on terror must be waged. And I want to show in the rest of my talk why this is actually a false argument. And I think what's also interesting is that what this does, and I didn't have a chance to check whether all of the incidents that they mentioned are true or not, but let's even say it does, it is true. one study found that there are far more deaths attributed to what the US has done in the Middle East. Al mentioned over 1 million deaths. And the figures that come from this dwarf in comparison. And so what this serves to do rhetorically is to present this menacing, huge enemy out there while it keeps our crimes under the rug, as it were. So I wanted to start with that. There's another interesting clip here where they say, all presidents and all leaders don't want to actually come out and insult Islam, and they show clips, where there are qualifiers that Bush and others make, and so forth. But in reality, actually, even though Bush and others do say that they don't think that Islam is the enemy and so on, they have to. This is the 21st century, we're not in the 18th century. But at the same time, their rhetoric actually helps to fuel a generalized vilification. And I want to read a clip, a little bit, from Bush's address to the nation last year, September 11th. He says, quote, "Since the horror of 9/11, we've learned a great deal about the enemy, and we have learned that their goal is to build a radical Islamic empire where women are prisoners in their home, men are beaten for missing prayer meetings, and terrorists have a safe haven to plan and launch attacks in America and other civilized nations. The war against this enemy is more than a military conflict. It is the decisive ideological struggle of the 21st century and the calling of our generation. The struggle has been called a clash of civilizations. In truth, it is a struggle for civilization. We are fighting to maintain the way of life enjoyed by free nations." So what you see in all of these examples and arguments that I have just given is a very polarized view of the world, right? On the one hand, we have the values of freedom, democracy, women's rights, rationality, liberty, civilization, and all not so coincidentally associated with Christianity. And on the other hand, we have people who are irrational, evil, barbaric, uncivilized, and who apparently hate freedom and democracy and want to create, according to Horowitz and Bush and so on, an Islamic empire that stretches from Europe to Southeast Asia. And what I want to argue is that this view is actually quite false. It is myth. It is not based on reality, because if we actually start to interrogate these claims, we find that the actual history of the relationship between the East and the West and so on are not backed up, are not supported in the arguments made by these people. And in particular, I want to focus on 4 themes that are used quite excessively today, 4 myths, if you will. Number 1, the idea that Islam is a uniquely sexist religion. 2, that the Muslim mind is incapable of rationality and science. 3, that Islam is inherently violent. And 4, that the West spreads democracy while Islam spawns terrorism. So those are the 4 themes around which I want to organize my presentation. Now I want to start off by saying that this rhetoric is actually not new. It actually has its origins in a body of thought that comes into being in the late 18th and early 19th century, a body of thought that gets called Orientalist scholarship. Now, Edward Said, whose work you may know, has written quite extensively on this, and he argues that it's in this period, the late 18th, early 19th century, which also is a period of colonial expansion in Europe, saw the systematic study of the Orient by Europe. And so what you see is that schools get set up, centers get set up in France and Britain and elsewhere. And when Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798, he takes with him not just an army of soldiers, but an army of scholars. He takes archaeologists, he takes botanists, he takes all sorts of people who can gather information not for use by the Egyptians, but for use by the French in order to better colonize, in order to better control the subject population. So that really is Orientalist thought. Now, Orientalist thought has many features that it has. I want to speak about 2. It draws on this civilizational view of history. That is the idea that civilizations come into being, they prosper, and then they go into decline. And what this view argues is that civilizations are distinct identities. They exist in isolation from each other, and they have a core set of values that actually drive them. So what are some of the values then associated with the West? Well, not so coincidentally, it's freedom, law, rationality, science, progress, intellectual curiosity, spirit of invention, and so on. These are seen as the core values of the West, and the West itself becomes this civilization rooted in ancient Greece, right? Well, what then about the other civilizations? Well, not so coincidentally, the other civilizations are seen as being inferior to the West, and in particular the world of Islam was characterized as despotic, static, undemocratic, and rigid. Now, that's one tenet of Orientalist thought. The other is the idea of race, theories of race. What you see again, during the Enlightenment 17th, 18th century is that human beings are now, for the first time in history, starting to be classified according to skin color, according to their race. And race itself becomes a marker of difference between various groups. Now, it's not just that this is historically the first time that this is happening, but there's also a hierarchy that is established between various racial groups, with European Caucasians at the top and Indigenous peoples close to the bottom. Here's how the French scholar Maxime Robinson puts it in terms of the race-based understandings of Muslim. He says, quote, "The Oriental may always have been characterized as a savage enemy, but during the Middle Ages he was at least considered on the same level as his European counterpart. In the 19th century, however, he became something quite different and quite sealed off in his own specificity. This is the origin of Homo Islamicus, a notion widely accepted even today." That is, this idea that this is a species, a race that is completely different from other races. So in sum, Orientalists argue that the West is a dynamic, complex, and ever-changing society, while the Orient, particularly the world of Islam, is static, barbarian, despotic. Therefore, what conclusion do you draw? That it is the burden of the West, it is the white man's burden to go out and bring progress and bring change to the uncivilized world. Now, these ideas, as we know from reading poetry by Rudyard Kipling and others, was used to justify French and English conquest of North Africa as well as the Middle East in the 18th and 19th century. But they're not relics of the past. There's a tendency sometimes to look back at these ideas and say, oh my God, they're just so backwards. But what's stunning is their relevance even today. A book, for instance, like Raphael Patai's book, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called The Arab Mind. And this was the book that was actually the torture manual on which the tortures at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere were derived. What is the Arab mind if not this racialized civilizational view? The idea that there's just one Arab mind and all Arabs are the same, right? So this idea, I think, still has a lot of resonance today. Modern day Orientalists are people like Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington, who together have popularized this notion of the clash of civilizations. Lewis came up with the term, but it was Samuel Huntington who actually ran with it and popularized it. And here's what he argues. He says, quote, "Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free markets, the separation of church and state often have little resonance in Islamic societies." So, I've read you something from the 17th century and something from the 20th century, and they sound remarkably similar. Now, these ideas actually remained on the margins through the 1990s, when the Clinton administration preferred the language of humanitarian intervention to actually justify several wars in the 90s. But now, today, it's again acquired center stage, and both Republicans and Democrats, I would argue, have become comfortable with this rhetoric. And the end result, I think, is a political climate where Islamophobic ideas are largely taken for granted. And the unfortunate reality is that even people who call themselves progressives, people who call themselves, part of the left, have actually bought into this clash of civilizations thesis. Now, the next image that I have for you is the cover of Bernard Lewis's article when it first appeared in the Atlantic magazine. This is it, if you are following along. What you see is this angry, bearded, turbaned Muslim man with the American flag in his eyes. I wish it worked, but you can see it. But that is your typical caricature, isn't it, of the Muslim man, turban, angry, scowling, just death to America kind of thing. Now, unfortunately, if you flip the page, this is the cover of The Progressive from last year, which has a bearded, scowling, turbaned Muslim man wielding this large scimitar against what seems to be this puny white guy who's losing this battle between the clash of civilizations, right? And so it's very unfortunate that this thesis has come to be accepted to the extent that it has, even among people on the left who typically have championed the rights of the oppressed and have not stood on the side of the oppressor. Another example I'll give you is Benjamin Barber's book, Jihad versus Macworld. Again, similar sort of polarized view. So I want to start by saying that these views, first of all, have actually no grounds, because it assumes that Islam is somehow this monolithic religion. And this is the basis on which all these other myths that I'm going to talk about are based. Now, the reality, of course, is that Islam is not a monolithic religion. In fact, Islam, according to the US State Department, is practiced by 1.5 billion people around the world. 85% are Sunni, 15% are Shia. These are the main branches, but there are many other branches as well. And there are several countries and regions which have Muslim majority populations that span the globe, from Indonesia to Bangladesh, several Asian countries, the Middle East, and North Africa. And if you look at how Islam is practiced in each of these countries, it looks very different in each of these countries. And the reason is because as the religion spread, just like any other of the world's major religions, it adapted to the local customs. And so the practice is very different. So for instance, Sufi Islam in northern India is very, very different from the Wahhabi Salafi Islam that's practiced in Saudi Arabia. So the claim that there's somehow this homogeneous, monolithic Islam is actually quite ridiculous. And not only that, but the gamut of political practices in nations that are predominantly Muslim range the gamut from secular democracies like Indonesia to dictatorships like Saudi Arabia. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Islam is not a monolith. But then the other argument that we've heard, and this is the first myth I want to talk about, is the idea that somehow Islam is a uniquely sexist religion. Now, we heard this argument in relation to the war on Afghanistan. You may remember that Bush promised to liberate the women of Afghanistan. Similarly, recently there was a ban that was passed in France. It was called the hijab ban. Allegedly, it was to try to remove all religious symbols in schools, but in reality, it was really about the hijab, the headscarf that Muslim women wear, and the promise was that it would liberate Muslim women. Well, the reality is that neither Afghan nor French Muslim women have been liberated by these actions. Today, various human rights organizations have shown that women in Afghanistan are in fact no better off than they were before the war. If anything, the war has created worse conditions for women, particularly in the rural areas. There was a short period for which women in Kabul, which is the main city, had some autonomy, and they went out and they made lovely films like Afghanistan Unveiled. If you ever get a chance to see it, Afghanistan Unveiled is a really good film about the condition of women in the rural areas and so on, but even that is starting to erode. The Taliban, by the way, according to a report that was released last week, is now in control of 54% of Afghanistan, and but that's a different talk altogether. But suffice it to say that the women have not been liberated, and many human rights organizations have shown there is no democracy, there is no freedom, and in fact, if anything, they're under the control of the warlords who are our allies. Similarly, the French ban also actually increased persecution against Muslim girls, and if anything, feminism means anything. It means giving women the right to choose, the right whether to choose whether they want to wear the veil or not. And what this is essentially is a restriction, I think, of religious rights and religious freedoms. So anyway, these are the two most contemporary arguments of when this, two instances of when this argument was used. This argument actually has a very long history, and I want to go back to the British in Egypt in 1882. Britain occupied Egypt, and this is Lord Cromer. I'm going to use his words. He oversaw the occupation, and this is what he said about Egyptian society and about Islam. He says, quote, "Islam as a social system has been a complete failure. The degradation of women in the East is a canker that begins its destructive work early in childhood and is eaten into the whole system of Islam, end quote. And the solution was that Muslims should be, quote, persuaded or forced into imbibing the true spirit of Western civilization, end quote. Now, for Lord Cromer, apparently there was no contradiction between being this champion of women's rights in Egypt, while also being the founding member of the Men's League for Opposing Women's Suffrage back in Britain. So that really gives you a sense of, the hypocrisy and where rhetoric gets used to advance an imperial agenda. I think that's true too of Bush, isn't it? He hasn't done very much for women right here, and so when we hear him claiming that he's going to go off on his horse in his Jodhpurs to rescue Afghan women, we have to smell a rat. Now, imperialist justifications for war and occupation have always been a sham, but one might still ask, is Islam as a religion unique in the way it treats women? After all, women's rights have been severely curtailed by right-wing Islamists in power, such as in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Even in Iran, after the Shah was deposed and so on, women saw their rights being taken back and so on. But the question is there something unique about that? And I want to argue that it is not. In fact, all of the world's major religions are, in one way or the other, sexist. If we think about Christianity, after all, aren't we told that Eve was created out of Adam's rib? Let's talk about the burning of witches. This was a practice that was carried out as recently as 3 centuries ago, right here in the United States. And I think even today, women's rights are under attack right here. Only 13% of US counties actually offer abortion services. Several states have passed laws that allow pharmacists to refuse to fill birth control prescriptions. And at the same time as women's control of their own body has been restricted, the fetus has actually been given rights. And all of this entire shift, this backlash, if you will, that's how Susan Faludi talks about it, this backlash is in no small part due to the influence that the Christian right has played on US politics. You may also have heard how Nicaragua, which is a predominantly Catholic country, passed a ban on abortion very recently, even in cases where a woman's life is in danger. In short, I bring all this up to say that Islam really has no monopoly on misogyny. And while predominantly Muslim countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia have elected women to positions of heads of state, the US is yet to do so. So the main point here is this: it is not to privilege one religion over the other. It is to say that the dominant religion in any society does not automatically shape social reality. Rather, religious ideology itself is shaped and reshaped by historical factors. Now, there's been much debate about the role of women in Islam. The Quran, I haven't actually read it myself, but I've read what people have said about this. The Quran, like any religious text, is contradictory, and it lends itself to multiple interpretations. And so there are passages in the Quran that grant women the same rights as men to divorce, that permit them to own and inherit property, and all of this marked a step forward for women in Arabian society in the 8th century. But there are also passages that condone polygamy and that restrict women's inheritance rights to only half of what men are entitled to. So scholars like Leela Ahmed, Asma Barlas, who write very well on this topic, have argued that Islam in and of itself is not misogynistic, but the way that it has been used in various societies at various points have lent itself to these kinds of interpretations. So they point to passages, egalitarian passages in the Quran that suggest equality. Barlas argues that sexist interpretation are the product of particular societies and so on. And there are various debates between people like Montgomery Watt and Maxine Robinson and so on as to the extent to which Arab society was patrilineal or matrilineal and so on. I won't go into all of those debates, but suffice it to say that Arab society at the time, in the 8th century, was predominantly a patrilineal society, but you did have some pockets of matrilineal autonomy. Some tribes actually gave women a lot of power and so on. This is what explains why Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad's first wife, her name was Khadija, she was 40 at the time, and she proposed to the 27-year-old Muhammad. And while Khadija was Muhammad's only wife at the time, she actually had several husbands. After her death, he would of course go on to practice polygamy and marry several women. Now, the point of giving you all this history is to say that as Islam spread, it actually adopted the cultural practices of the various empires that came under its control, including the neighboring Persian and Byzantine empires. Now, among the Christians who populated the Middle East and the Mediterranean, there were actually very much more rigid practices associated with women. So in the Christian Byzantine Empire, for instance, the sexes were segregated. Women were not supposed to be seen in public. They had to be veiled, and they were given only rudimentary education. And so what you see, what historians talk about, is that as the Islamic Empire incorporated these other empires, they assimilated their cultural and social practices. In short, the practices today that we see as misogynist as being connected to Islam actually came to be inherited from the neighboring Christian, Persian, and Jewish societies, which were assimilated under the Islamic empire. And so far from being unique to Islam, these practices were in fact quite prevalent during that time. And another example I want to give is that this is not the first time that the women in this region saw their rights curtailed under Western influence. Another example is from Egyptian society, when Egypt was conquered by the Greeks in 333 BC. Now, in contrast to Greek society, where, again, Greek society, women led segregated lives, their prime role was to care for children, the law considered a woman to be a veritable child, right? That was Greek society at the time. In Egyptian society, not all women, but upper class women actually held quite high status. There's a period that's known as the New Kingdom, which is from 1570 to 950 BC. Egyptian men and women were actually considered equals under the law. Women had the right to inherit property and to own and manage it. Marriage laws were egalitarian, and women could freely move in society and weren't secluded. Now, this is not to say that sexism didn't exist. Of course it existed. You know, we've lived in sexist societies for times immemorial. It was still very much a male-dominated society, but the systematic oppression of the kind found in Greek society didn't actually exist in Egypt until Greek conquest of Egypt. And here's a little excerpt from Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, you may know him. This is what he said, quote, "The male is by nature superior and the female inferior. The one rules and the other is ruled," end quote. In short, the idea that somehow the Western tradition has always been liberal, I think, is a myth. And as the case that I just mentioned showed, there have been other instances where women in the East have seen their rights being curtailed. And the point is a simple one, really, and that is that where women do enjoy rights, typically it's a product of their own self-activity. It took women no less than 100 years in the United States to actually win the right to vote, and then another 60 years to win the right to control their own bodies. In other words, it's the self-activity of women, no matter where they are, whether they live in countries where the religion is predominantly Christianity or Hinduism and so on. It's been women themselves and their male allies fighting for these rights that have gained them these rights. And I think in the West, we have to get over this notion of seeing Muslim women as victims in need of rescue. I think Muslim women are just as capable as any other type of women to fight for their own rights and their own agency. And I put in a few images to sort of give us a different way of looking at Muslim women. The first is protests that were held in Cairo after the government said that reports of sexual attacks were exaggerated. The second, I'm sorry, they would have looked so much more pretty on the screen, but what are you going to do? Technology doesn't always cooperate. The second is from protests in Pakistan against some of the abortion laws that exist in that country. The next two are from demonstrations in Syria and in Lebanon. And the last one, the two women with a hijab, I put that in there because typically when you have women wearing the headscarf, you expect them to be docile, and I just love this image where they've got their heads, they've got their hands pumping in the air and so on. And I think it challenges us to think differently. Right. Moving on then to...
Could you tell us about this demonstration? Do you know anything about it?
I think it was it was shortly after the invasion by Israel. And there were massive demonstrations about having to do with the new government and so on. Yeah, but I'll check and email you the exact details. Myth 2. The Muslim mind is incapable of science, rational thinking, and reason. I bring that up because if you look at the next two cartoons, look at this one. I'm sorry. You have, I think this is Ahmadinejad. He's got what looks like a nuke. He's carrying it. And on this door, which is the nuclear club, allegedly, the rules are coat, tie, and sanity required. And Ahmadinejad is being kept out. He has, obviously, not the sanity to go in there. And so this idea of, the East. Let me give you a second to look at it. And while you're there, if you want to flip to the next one, it's I think Ahmadinejad or some Iranian on a weapon. This is the Doctor Strangelove, right? You remember that?
Yeah.
And I'll let you read it.
Strange one.
All right, so this argument too has a long history, and I want to give you a little background. And I'll give you one more example of when this argument was used actually first. Do you remember when Pope Benedict gave his now infamous speech in Rottenburg last year? He equated Catholicism with reason and Islam with violence and the lack of reason. And he paraphrased this 14th century Byzantine emperor who stated that any religion that's spread through violence goes against reason, against nature, and so on, and is, quote, not to act in accordance with reason and contrary to God's nature. Similarly, in the 19th century, a man by the name Ernest Renan, he was giving a lecture at the Sorbonne, and this is what he said. He said, quote, early Islam and the Arabs who professed it were hostile to the scientific and philosophical spirit. And there's another huge quote, but I'm going to try to cut that out. I'll read it later. Similarly, the debate around Iran is all about, can we trust these irrational, crazy people to actually have nuclear weapons? Never mind, the US is the only country that's actually ever used nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and so on, but we will assert that we are the police, the moral police of deciding who gets it and so on. Never mind, of course, that Iran is actually surrounded by countries that possess nuclear weapons, whether you're talking about India, Pakistan, China, Russia, Israel, not to mention US bases in Qatar, Iraq, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and so on. So any rational actor in that region would try to acquire it, although the recent report by the NIE says that they stopped making a nuclear bomb in 2003. So anyway, this myth too has a long history, and I want to deal with this by actually looking at the hidden history of Islam and science, because this is also a way, I think, to debunk the idea of clash of civilization. I want to show that, in fact, the world of Islam and the West have actually had an intertwined history, and that's important to know about. Now, after the fall of Rome, which was roughly from the 5th to the 10th century, Europe entered the so-called Dark Ages. It was a period of scientific, artistic, and cultural decline. Now, during the 7th century, Islam came onto the scene, and the Muslim armies established a vast empire that stretched from Central Asia through parts of Europe all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And the two first Muslim empires, the Umayyad and the Abbasid, actually recognized the advanced developments of the kingdoms and the peoples that they had conquered, and so they took it upon themselves to assimilate this knowledge and to adopt these cultures. So they established these giant libraries and translation centers where the great works of science, medicine, philosophy, both East and West, were collected and translated. And this age of translation was actually followed by a period of great creativity when a new generation of Muslim thinkers and scientists built on this knowledge and then made their own contributions. I'll give you a few examples. The Persian scholar Ibn Sina, he's known in Western histories as Avicenna, laid the basis for the study of logic, science, philosophy, politics, and medicine. Ibn Rushd, and so on and so forth, plenty of such examples. And science, actually, if you read about this period, thrived in the Muslim world. Now, when Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, its renaissance in art, culture, and the sciences actually drew from its own legacy in the past, and European thinkers flocked to these Muslim libraries in Spain and so on, and they not only relearned their own traditions and history, but they absorbed the further development of this tradition by Muslim scholars. But this history, of course, is either completely ignored or revised by the Orientalists, who somehow present this mythical entity known as the West that apparently developed in isolation from the rest of the world. In fact, modern medicine would not have existed, according to one Columbia University professor, if it hadn't been for the work of Avicenna, of Ibn Sina. So, I think that's an example of the intertwined nature of these cultures. Now, it's also significant, I think, that the Pope, in denouncing Islam for lacking reason, fails to bring up the Catholic Church's own hostile opposition to scientific thought and scientific revolution. During the Enlightenment, for instance, much of the scientific innovations that took place stood in opposition, isn't it, to Christian dogma, and was seen as a huge threat by the Catholic Church. And so scientists were often severely punished. You may know about Galileo, who was forced to recant and then asked to lead the rest of his life under house arrest. Unfortunately, Giordano Bruno, refused to recant, and so he was imprisoned and later burned at the stake. So this is what was done during the Enlightenment. And what's interesting, of course, is that the Pope, who comes out and talks about the history of violence in Islam, chooses to ignore Christianity's own history. And the irony, I think one of the great irony of our times, is that this present Pope, he used to be the head of the Vatican office of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Does anyone know what that is? Yeah. It's the Inquisition. And so, he can say this about the spreading of religion through violence and apparently just get away with it. No one's going to ask him questions. Right, myth 3. I have 2 more myths, bear with me. Myth 3, Islam is an inherently violent religion. We've heard this argument again and again. Islam is violent. The teachings of the Quran lead to the kind of terrorist actions that we saw earlier and so on. I brought one of the Danish cartoons. If there is a practicing Muslim in the audience, I don't mean to disrespect you. I just brought that as an educational tool. It's the very next cartoon after the insanity thing. I don't know where mine went. You may have it, mine is missing. That's right. Can someone just hold that up? That is nothing. What that is the Prophet Muhammad with a bomb strapped to his turban. This is nothing if not the idea that Islam is inherently violent. This guy in the 7th century, apparently, violence on his head, literally. Now, the term jihad, which is often, as you saw in the video that I showed you, is often used to signify holy war, and apparently the East is waging this holy war against the West. Columbia professor Mahmoud Mamdani argues that actually this translation is lacking. He states that the term jihad has 2 meanings. The first, which is the greater jihad, refers to the struggle within oneself against one's own weaknesses. And the second, which is the lesser jihad, is about self-preservation and self-defense, and is more appropriately described as just war rather than holy war. And he shows in his very excellent book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, how just war has actually been used, quote, occasionally and in isolated situations, marking points of crisis in Islamic history, end quote. Yet this is not how the history of Islam is represented by politicians and the media. Instead, we're told again and again, it's a violent religion, it's an intolerant religion, right? Can you hear Bush saying evildoers, he uses that every opportunity he gets, and so on. And recently I was reading the US News and World Report's special issue on Islam. I don't know if you saw that. It was actually quite a good issue. The story that they told about the Crusades and so on was very accurate and so on. But there's one part where they have this historical overview and this little sort of chart called Spreading the Faith, a Chronology. And the chronology begins with the birth of Muhammad in 570, traces various developments, and guess where it ends? The events of 9/11. In short, there is a straight line between the birth of the Prophet Muhammad and the events of 9/11. Now, of course, I think these claims are rather self-serving because they serve to justify the level of violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, the 1 million deaths in Iraq, if you add that up to the deaths caused by the sanctions in the 1990s, when the US had sanctions on Iraq, the UN estimates the figures are almost in the high 1.8, 1.92 million range, of which 500,000 were children. In other words, even if we have a conservative estimate, the US is responsible directly for the deaths of 2.5 million people in Iraq. Now that's a genocide, as Al put it earlier, and yet we focus on these spectacular incidents as a way to deflect attention from this larger structural violence that is happening on a daily basis. Now I want to discuss and address this myth in two ways. First, I want to address Christianity's own history of violence, not as a way to say that Islam has no history of violence. Of course, all religions have a history of violence, but I think we should put the two on the same plane to see why it is that the violence of one religion gets highlighted and the other remains invisible. So let me start with that. Now, the 2 decades after Prophet Muhammad died in 632, indeed it is true that the way the religion was spread was through war, it was through violence and so on, and the two great empires that existed at the time, the Byzantines and the Persians, lost actually to the small ragtag band of Islamic fighters and so on, largely because these two empires had been at war with each other for a century. The people had grown tired of these wars, and in some instances they actually welcomed the Muslims because there was a lot of persecution even among various denominations of Christianity. And so they said, all right, we'll get these guys in because they're going to allow us to pay a tax, they won't persecute us, better them than constantly being harassed and kicked out of our homes and so on. So anyway, once in power, and unlike their Orthodox Christian counterparts who persecuted heretics and ruled through fear, intimidation, and terror, the Muslim invaders actually gave people a choice, either convert to Islam or pay a tax. And the reason for this tolerance is actually because in Islam, there's an understanding that Judaism and Christianity are actually other kinds of interpretation of the same doctrine, that is, the God is shared, and therefore they don't persecute. There's a lot of tolerance for Judaism as well as for Christianity. Not true for Hinduism, by the way. I'm from India, and I'll tell you other stories about that. Now, while the Pope and the likes of him like to focus on this history, we don't hear, for instance, about how Christianity itself also came into being through conquest and conversion, first in the Roman world and then in the neighboring areas of Europe, Armenia, Arabia, Eastern Africa, and Central Asia. And this is even before the Crusades could begin. The religious wars waged by European Christians from the 11th to the 13th century were driven in part by religious fervor, but in large part also by other motivations, including the ability to gain wealth. That was also one of the motivations for it. I'll give you some examples from the Crusades. The first crusade of 1099, the Crusaders actually went on a killing spree after they took control of Jerusalem, and they murdered almost the entire population of Muslim men, women, and children. And the Jews were not spared either. The Jews actually went into a synagogue and they blockaded themselves to protect themselves. What did the Crusaders do? They set fire to the synagogue and they made sure that every single Jewish man, woman, and child died. They didn't allow them to actually escape. And this is not surprising because if you read about the Crusades, when it first begins, as they're marauding their way through Europe, the first target are actually Jews in Germany. This is the first sort of systematic extermination of Jews in Europe. Similarly, in the Third Crusade, Richard the Lion-Hearted, we hear very good things about him. This was King Richard of England. He beheaded thousands of men in cold blood, in full view of their armies after a battle. Just one after another, just chopped off their heads. In contrast to this, the Sultan of Egypt, Saladin, after he retook Jerusalem from the Crusaders, actually forbade acts of vengeance and violence against Crusaders. Jews were given state money to rebuild synagogues, and churches were left untouched. And in fact, this is consistent with the way in which Muslim empires, for the most part, treated Jews and Christians. In fact, during the 500 years of Muslim reign in Jerusalem, from the 7th to the 11th century, Christian churches were largely left untouched, and Jews were permitted to return and to resettle in the area. What a historic irony we have here. Now, of course, this harmony was violently interrupted by the Crusades, and various churches and synagogues and so on were set on fire and destroyed. Now, the Christian empires were actually no less brutal to their own population, and the Inquisition actually stand out as an example of the incredibly repressive form that Christian rule took in Europe at the time. The Inquisition, by the way, is a series of movements orchestrated by the Catholic Church to reassert economic control over Europe. And so the Spanish Inquisition, for instance, is remembered for its utter brutality, mass torture, and the burning of men and women at the stake. You may have seen the paintings and the operas and so on associated with this. So it's no wonder then that many Jews and Christians actually fled Europe to escape the Inquisition and went to make a home under the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans, again, far more tolerant society. Jews and Christians lived peacefully. And in fact, many of them were able to attain high positions in the bureaucracies. Sometimes they converted, at other times they did not. And so what I've given you is actually 10 centuries of relatively peaceful coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And so the idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition is actually fairly new, because for the most part, the relationship has been hostile. And in fact, the relative harmony between Christians, Muslims, and Jews in the Muslim world has actually been more of a hallmark. Now, no sane person, looking at the brutal history of Christianity, would draw the conclusion that all Catholics are bloodthirsty fanatics, right? I don't think they would. And to my knowledge, no mainstream newspaper has actually drawn a straight line between the Crusades and the Holocaust, for instance. Yet, when it comes to demonizing Muslims, it appears that this sort of logic is completely acceptable. And this is how Bernard Lewis, who I mentioned earlier, puts it. He says, quote, "The struggle between Islam and the West has lasted 14 centuries. It has consisted of a long series of attacks and counterattacks, jihads and crusades, conquests and reconquests. Today, much of the Muslim world is again seized by an intense and violent resentment of the West. Suddenly, America has become the arch enemy, the incarnation of evil, the diabolical opponent of all that is good for Muslims." So you see how this history of peaceful coexistence, gets distorted by the likes of the peddlers of the clash of civilizations thesis. And the reason that they have to focus on culture, right? You look at their books, you look at the Clash of Civilizations, the roots of Muslim rage, and so on. History has nothing to do with it. They don't actually make reference to actual historical events. It's all about culture. It's all about culture talk, because that's the way in which this argument gets made. Because if you actually look at history, the argument falls flat on its face. Now, of course, there are people in the Middle East who have a similar view to the Clash of Civilizations rhetoric, and they are just as wrong as their Western counterparts in this argument. The US is in Iran and Afghanistan not to wage a religious war, but to assert control over the region's strategic resource, which, as we know, is oil. And this is why Saudi Arabia, which adheres to the ultra-conservative Wahhabi Islamist tradition, is an ally of the United States, but the largely secular Syrian Ba'athist Party is not. So this is not a religious war, and recourse to those sorts of arguments actually don't make sense. Last myth, and then I'll come to a close. The West spreads democracy while Islam spawns terrorism. Now, the classic version is that Islam is not capable of democracy. It can only produce despotism, static, unchanging, and so on, and therefore it's the white man's burden to actually bring democracy. And of course, we've heard this argument coming from the Bush administration. There were no weapons of mass destruction, no connections to 9/11. Ooh, we'll pull out another trick from our bag of tricks. We're going to bring democracy to Iraq. And of course, all of this is completely false. Again, fantastic reports on Afghanistan, which I don't have the time to go into. I gave this talk at Hunter the other day. Anyway, this rhetoric, of course, is, again, not based in reality. I don't know if people have read Stephen Kinzer, the journalist book Overthrow. It's a fantastic read. He's a journalist. He's gone to many of the countries that he talks about, but he shows that in fact the US has not brought democracy in the vast majority, if not all of the cases, and has actually destabilized democratic rules and installed dictators. This is not just true of the Middle East, it is true of Latin America, it is true of East Asia, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to really critically interrogate this claim that the US is bringing democracy in the Middle East. And so I want to do a quick history of US policy since the Second World War. Now, one of the things that you see after the Second World War, this is also the period of national liberation movements around the world, but also in the Middle East. Several Middle Eastern nations, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and so on, all shake up the colonial foundations of their nations. And in this comes a new mood, a mood for change, a mood for reform, and so on. And various new political parties and formations come into being. One of them is Arab nationalism, associated with the Egyptian president Nasser, as well as with the Baathists in Syria and Iraq and so on. But you also see the emergence of socialist and communist parties and so on, who are at this point vying for influence. Now, what is the US's orientation towards this? Well, this is the Cold War. So we have oil interests in the Middle East, but it's also a question of keep the Soviet Union out and make sure that the United States has control over the resources in the region. And if you read all of the doctrines, Eisenhower, followed by Nixon, followed by Carter, and so on, it's all precisely about managing these two goals. How will the US keep control over oil and keep the Soviet Union out of the region? Now, what are some ways in which these goals are realized? Well, the US had powerful naval bases and forces and so on in the region. They intervened whenever they saw it appropriate to do so. 58 Marines landed in Lebanon to make sure that the pro-Western government, which was under movement, and now the Islamists. And by the way, the Shah also got rid of all political parties except his own. So much for democracy, in the region. But the key threat really to the US was Arab nationalism. And the US's policy really in trying to deal with Arab nationalism is to support various Islamist formations as a bulwark against the left. And so they supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and they supported Saudi Arabia, which now starts to fund, arm, train, and so on, various Islamist groups all around the Middle East. So at the end of the day, what do we have? We have a situation where we come to the late 1960s. Arab nationalism had its own internal weaknesses. This was a movement led by the middle classes in the interests of the middle classes. They created repressive societies. They didn't deliver on economic promises that were made a decade or two earlier. They lost in '67 to the war with Israel, the Six-Day War. So their credibility had all but crumbled by the late 1960s. Now it is into that political vacuum that's created by the crumbling of secular nationalism, or what Nasser would call Arab socialism. Because what he meant by socialism was state capitalism, right? The state would actually run various industries and so on. It's into that vacuum that various right-wing Islamist forces now come in and start to play a key role. So at the end of the day, if you actually look at the situation, there are two reasons why today Islamist forces are, kind of triumph in the region. One has to do with the role of the US in marginalizing the left, whether that involved giving the names of Communist Party members to sympathetic regimes who then went out and killed them and so on, or marginalizing Arab secular nationalism. Those are external factors, but then there are internal factors as well, which is the weaknesses of these movements itself, and at the end of the day, that these are the major forces that we see. However, and this is where I want to address, again, what we saw at the beginning of this video, the idea that there is this vast network of Islamists who are out to dominate the world and create this vast Muslim empire. In fact, that's not true. If you actually look at the Islamist parties, around the world, they span the gamut from the moderate Islamic Justice and Development Party, the AKP in Turkey, you may have heard of them, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Jihadi and Wahhabi fundamentalists who are now concentrated in Pakistan's tribal area, to Hamas and Hezbollah, which actually emerged out of the struggle against Zionism. So it's a wide range of groups that have different politics, different strategies, different tactics. They're not a monolith bent on world domination. In fact, they often disagree with each other. There's an excellent book by Fawaz Gurjes where he shows that after 9/11, Al-Qaeda was all but marginalized in the Middle East. Some of the main Islamist forces in the region, in Egypt, in Lebanon, and so on, denounced Al-Qaeda in no uncertain terms, saying that this was adventurous, this was ridiculous, and they were largely isolated in this context. Similarly, during the 1991 Gulf War, the Algerian FIS actually broke with its Saudi financial backers and took the side of Iraq. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, these are the people that the US funded via Pakistan in the late 70s, and which fought the proxy war with the Soviet Union. After they defeat the Soviet Union, first of all, they fight each other for power. And then the Taliban comes in, the Taliban being a product of Pakistan and the ISI and the military in Pakistan, and then they fight them. And I bring up all these examples to say that this is not a monolithic group, they are not a united group of Islamofascists who are bent on world domination. I'll finally come to a conclusion with this. I think today, the reason why much of this history that I've laid out is not public knowledge, is not something that somebody on the street will just say, yes, I know the history of Islam and science, or the Renaissance, or anything like that. It's because we have a very weak anti-war movement in this country. And it's really unfortunate that people on the left, progressives and liberals, have bought into this clash of civilizations arguments. And I think what that does is it weakens our movement, it weakens our side, and it allows the dominant logic of empire to go unchallenged in the heart of empire. Because if you think about the war on terror, what's that rhetoric serve to do? We know that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the big bogeyman, right? The US could do anything it wanted, not only domestically, but internationally, because my God, otherwise the Soviet Union would bomb us, would, dominate the world. It was a catch-all, wonderful justification to get away with anything. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there isn't a similar bogeyman that's available. Of course, they tried to get rogue states, failed states, terrorists, and so on. Didn't work quite as well, but after 9/11, terrorism and the war on terror has actually become this convenient excuse to then launch an endless war that actually is leading to massive debt. The US is now in debt to the tune of $7 trillion to the rest of the world. This money is coming out of our healthcare, it is coming out of our schools, it is coming out of public works like bridges which should be reinforced, or levees that need to be constructed, and so on. So I think all of us have a stake in deciding how these arguments are put forward, and actually have a stake in challenging them. I think ultimately this is a politics of fear, and that's why I put the last cartoon in there. You'll see that it's this series of planes that are coming towards New York. Do you have it?
Yeah.
It's a politics of fear, I think, that keeps people quiet, that keeps people isolated, and that keeps people from coming out and speaking out, even those who know better, even those who know this history and so on. And I think we have to rise beyond that, and we have to challenge ourselves to confront Islamophobia and to build an anti-war movement that not only condemns US adventurism around the world, but also defends Arabs and Muslims when they're under attack right here. And I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say the future literally quite depends on us being able to build such a movement in the United States. So thank you for your time.
The outcry among Catholics, they were furious with him. You could read it in their papers. You could hear it in the church. But when 9/11 occurred, there was jubilation in all Muslim countries. This is what was shown. I looked at papers, I looked at the Muslim papers, I looked all over. I couldn't hear one voice. Not one person spoke up. Now maybe you feel that maybe somebody should have. But this is really, there has been no spokesperson who spoke up for the Muslim people, whatever it was, against 9/11, which was an atrocity.
I think there are plenty of people who can speak to that question, so I'll just start, and let's keep this as a conversation, and others should feel free to jump in. But I can send you hundreds, if not thousands, of articles from magazines, newspapers, television broadcasts, and so on, from the Muslim world that denounced in no uncertain terms the incidents of 9/11. I only brought up the Islamists because you would think that the more religious extremist elements would actually be jubilant about this and so on. But even they actually condemn this.
Not at all.
Check Fawaz Gurjers' book. He's a professor at Sarah Lawrence University, and he documents actually all of the statements that have been put out.
Yeah, I understand. Sorry.
I was just going to say that Iran was one of the first countries to offer assistance to the United States after 9/11. It was an immediate response.
And condemn the attack.
Yes.
A little bit about sexism. In Afghanistan, after they got rid of the king, the women really got liberation, if you want. They were able to attend university, they were able to be physicians or whatever. But the warlords were not happy and they attacked the central government. Central government, mistaken or not, got the Soviet Union involved. And what did the United States do? They created Osama bin Laden in order to liberate the women.
Absolutely right. In fact, Brzezinski, who was Carter's, what was he? Was he Secretary of State or was he
National
Security Advisor? There's that wonderful quote from him, isn't it, where he says that we did this in order to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. We made this trap so that they would come there and through this war they would have their own Vietnam. And in fact, that is what happened. And funding, all of the sources that I read shows that funding actually began for the Mujahideen before the Soviet Union actually invaded, and this holy warrior group was constructed precisely for the purpose of fighting the Soviet Union. And Rambo 2, I think, or Rambo 3 is actually dedicated to the holy warriors, the very same people who would then go on to carry out the events of 9/11. Yes.
I appreciate you bringing up the fact that there is indeed a hidden history. What many people does not talk about, and it would be great if it was talking about amongst not only Jews but Christians and also Muslims, is the fact that of the huge contribution that Jews played within the Golden Age of Spain, within
That's
the
right.
flowering of Islam,
Absolutely.
how that Jews were on the top, some of the top posts. But what was unfortunate in a lot of all groups except for the Jewish groups, because I'm an Orthodox Jew, that they don't talk about is also the oppressive government policies within the Golden Age, not only to Jews but also to Muslims. In fact, the tax was unbearable. There's many different Torah scholars, famous Torah scholars revered in Orthodox Judaism that were murdered, but also prominent Muslims were also murdered. So there was a lot of instability within that culture, and it wasn't discriminatory just to Jews, although they had to pay this enormous amount of tax. And the other
Absolutely. I mean, this was the Middle Ages. And yes.
right, and Jews went from the West to the East because it was survival.
Yeah.
That was the only way the Jewish people would have survived, was to go to the East. And I don't feel that always that educated Muslims such as yourself would be talking about how much there was a contribution, how much there was an interdependency among the groups within the Golden Age.
I was born into a Hindu family, but I became an atheist 20 years ago. So. Yes.
Having listened to a lot of the stories, long and sad, the history of the world, there's two sides to it, one of accomplishment, one of destruction. After all you're thinking about and studying this question, what possible answer or solution do you have to the limitation of absolute power and authority? What kind is there a solution to the problem?
Yes.
Could you repeat the question? It's hard to hear.
Me?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
All right. What kind of solution is there to authoritarianism, to absolute power, in a nutshell? I'm glad you raised that because a radio interview that I did recently, it began with exactly that premise. I don't know if you've heard of the author Chalmers Johnson. He's written the books Blowback, Sorrows of Empire, and his latest book is called Nemesis. And he actually advances exactly that argument. He says if you look at the attacks on civil liberties in the United States, you look at the debt that the United States is in right now, his projection for the future is actually, he says there's a possibility of a Napoleon-type character emerging in the military and the US heading towards a dictatorship. I haven't read the book, but this was how it was introduced to me in this radio program. And so there are people, progressives, who are drawing this sort of conclusion. And the way I responded to that and how I will respond to your question is that I prefer instead to look at the rich legacy of people's movements in the United States. Howard Zinn documents all of these movements that have been so amazing. I mean, the fact that we have something called an 8-hour day, or something called a weekend, or no child labor, and so on, is a product of ordinary people standing up, even under the most horrific conditions, organizing and fighting back. I mean, if today we're scared by this atmosphere that's been created, think about McCarthyism. Think about how difficult it was, for instance, for the Black Panthers to organize, how difficult it was for people in SDS to organize with COINTELPRO, and all of the intelligence that was being gathered and so forth. So I prefer not to take that view. I prefer to think that hopefully Americans will draw the conclusions that most of us don't benefit from these wars. In fact, this country is getting bankrupted by these wars, and will start to form movements for healthcare, for better schooling, and so on and so forth, to actually envision a different kind of future. That's the only hope. People's movements that actually, and citizenship involvement that actually holds, potential dictators in check.
Could you apply that to Iran, Iraq, the Middle East,
Yes.
the Arab world?
Absolutely.
Is that going to change in that direction?
Absolutely. I wrote a piece actually recently about various human rights movements in Iran. One of the things that's not mentioned, of course, women are oppressed in Iran. Under the law, they have less rights than men do and so on. But there's been a vibrant women's movement for at least a century. They've made various gains, and today they're quite strong. They've launched a campaign called the 1 Million Signatures, the 1 Million Signatures campaign, to actually try to change the law in Iran. And Shirin Ebadi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think in 2003, is a lawyer, a very outspoken person, and I quote her in my article, and she says, if people in the West are interested in advancing the rights of women in Iran, do not support a war, because that will be the immediate excuse that the clergy will use to squash all dissent, to squash all movements. And we've seen that happen everywhere. When there's a war, patriotism is ratcheted up to higher levels. And so absolutely, there have been movements, there are movements, and it is to those people that we need to look for a better future.
It's true there have been many good things happening, but why does it have to be an Islamic thing, that this good thing come out of Islam, or this good thing come out of Christianity? In fact, to each, there's a saying that for every action, there's a reaction. And sometimes the most terrible conditions breeds the most wonderful things in human endeavour. So to give credibility that Islam is good because good things come out of Islam, or Christianity is good because good things happen by people under Christian. These organisations have in fact generally put a lid and pressure downwards on these people, and it's in spite of these movements that people have created these situations. When the woman there said that people were that Islamists weren't sad at 9/11, the Christian right, Jerry Falwell and that, were saying that New York deserved it because of the secular, and vices in New York. So I think we're getting into a wrong idea to say that these good things that flourished under these oppressive religions were the result of these religions. When these religions in general put a pressure to stop these kind of things happening?
Absolutely. I'm an atheist, and in principle, I agree with your argument. I don't support or defend any religion or hold any religion above or below any other. But that said, we live in a world that is polarized along religious terms. And the demonization of one religion by the dominant empire is the primary means through which the domestic population is won to wars, to endless wars. And so in that context, we cannot eschew a discussion of religion, and we cannot shy away from talking about how their thesis, their arguments, the clash of civilization, these unique civilizations, those are actually wrong. We have to show that in fact there's a different history, and then we have to argue that we want a secular democratic society, one in which there's a separation between church and state, between religion and the state, and so on and so forth. That said, I also have a small, maybe I misheard you, but I have a small point of difference with what you're saying. I'm working on this article on what the left should say about political Islam, in which I argue that I think progressives should actually have a nuanced position towards various Islamist groups. That is to say, there are the real fundamentalists. The Taliban, for instance. I mean, these people, the Taliban comes out of these schools. The Afghan refugees who escaped during the 1980s into Pakistan sent their children to these schools called the Deobandi schools. They were cut off from their parents. This was not, you put them in a little yellow bus and they go to school and come back. No, they lived in these religious schools, and they were brainwashed with these ultra-conservative ideas. And the Afghan side of that, and they mixed with Pakistani students and so on. The Afghan group that comes out of it is the Taliban. What do they do when they come to power in between 94 and 96 in Afghanistan? They literally take Afghan society back into the Middle Ages, right? They're only interested in very sort of rudimentary commerce and so on and so forth. They destroy the constitutions. So there are these fundamentalist forces, but not everyone is like that, right? You have parliamentary organizations like the AKP, and then you have forces like Hezbollah and Hamas, right? And I think, honestly, I may not agree with the politics of Hamas, but I defend the right of people who elect a government to actually have that government rule them. And so I defend Hamas against Israel and the US's attempts to isolate them in the Gaza Strip. I also I disagree with Hezbollah's position on women and so on, but I think the reason they had majority support in the aftermath of the Israeli invasion, not just among Shia, but even among Christians and other denominations, Druze and so on, is because they played the role of national liberation. They were leading the struggle against an occupying, against an invading army and so on. So I think it has to be nuanced and context specific. Unfortunately, the secular left doesn't exist as a force. I wish they did, but as Arundhati Roy put it, if we wait for a secular, democratic, pro-women, pro-gay resistance movement, whether in Iraq or anywhere else, we're going to have to wait a long time. The fact on the ground is that there are two forces, the force of the US empire and then the resistance movement, and we have to take a side. And I think we have to take a side even if we don't agree with everything that these forces represent. Yes.
Do you think the elections in 08 will have any impact one way or the other on the way things evolve?
I had a lot of hope coming out of the 2006 elections, because this was a mandate against the hubris of the Bush agenda. It really was. It was a rejection of the Bush war in Iraq and so on. And for a small period of time, it looked like the Democratic Party was listening to liberals and the left. But boom, about 5-6 months ago, we go into election mode, and you can't really tell the difference. Clinton signs on to the bill that makes the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. Obama wants to bomb Pakistan. The objectives really are not that different. And why should they be? You look at the history of the 20th century. Who led us into the First World War? He ran on the platform, he will not lead us into the war, but he did. Woodrow Wilson gets elected, takes the United States into the First World War. Second World War, the New Deal Democrat, FDR, takes the US into the Second World War. LBJ escalates troops. The peace movement said half the way with LBJ. Well, we didn't even go 1/10 of the way with LBJ. and so on. Carter is the one who starts to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So I think these are two parties who agree on the same imperial agenda. One does it with a beautiful smile on their faces, and the other with an ugly scowl.
Don't you think a veto-proof majority might make a difference, would make a difference since 06?
Since 06, a veto-proof majority?
Yeah, thank God, if the majority was large enough to get something passed without...
They have the majority, they just don't have the political
They
will.
don't have a veto-proof majority, so... Yeah, so you have to get a veto-proof majority in order to make things happen.
Stop it without a majority. But let me ask one thing though. In the context where somewhere between 60 to 70% of Americans think that the war in Iraq is a mistake, don't you think that they could have been able to cobble this together? But instead it works the other way. That sections of the Democratic Party get pulled into the Republican agenda on issue after issue after issue.
Corporate America. All you have
That's
to
right.
all you have to do is watch who is funding their campaigns.
That's exactly
That's all
right.
you need to know.
That's exactly right. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I and my wife, we just got back from Spain, so I did a lot of reading. We did a lot of reading on Spanish history and such. And it seems that if you compare the United States to Spain, it was sort of like 17th century Spain. In other words, it was after the Golden Age when the empire was still very large, and a lot of money was being withdrawn from the New World and so on, gold and silver, and it was going right to other nations. It was just passing through Spain. At the same time that Spain had the largest armies in the world and actually sort of loaned out their armies to numerous other countries, for different wars, using the ideology of at that time Catholicism. Ours maybe is democracy as the ideology. It's very similar to, as I see it after reading this history, to the decline of Spain in the 17th century. We've become like the military power of the world, but very little else, and it's sort of sad in a way. And some of the writers would say, well, why didn't Spain should have realized what was happening? They should have reorganized their society to become more industrialized and so on, and more focused on their people, but they never did. And sort of I see a similarity in what's happening today here.
It's very interesting. Thank you. Well, the hour is late, so if there aren't any more...
No, okay.
Oh, please.
Just to take issue with one thing about blaming the left for its failure to do this or that. We really have to give credit to the rulers of America for having such a powerful propaganda machine, the greatest the world has ever known, and how it sows not just lies but confusion, ambiguity, and neutralizes large segments of the population. On the left, is confused about. We argue over, was Kosovo a humanitarian war?
Yes, that's right.
And so on.
Yeah.
In general, they use any tools they can to fool as many people as they can at the time. They're very good. I can't deny it.
I completely agree with you. I teach media studies, and so I begin one of my classes on media in the Middle East by saying we live in the most powerful empire in human history. We live in the richest country in human history. But as a result of that, we also live in the most propagandized society in human history. And so this class will hopefully try to shed some light on that. So I absolutely agree with you about that. And I think more specifically, we've yet to recover from McCarthyism. The destruction of the left by McCarthyism and by the Cold War has left a huge vacuum in the United States, and I think, it's...
And the assassinations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a huge challenge, and everywhere I go, I hope that the groups that I speak to will take that challenge up and actually rebuild the left, which is so desperately needed here and around the world. Thank you.